Bygones are bygones. Genesis chapter 32, verses 1 through 15, and Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 through 31, and Genesis chapter 33, verses 1 through 12. For 20 years, Jacob did not have to deal with his bloodthirsty brother. In Genesis chapter 27, verse 41, Jacob had made a fool out of Esau, made a mockery of brotherhood, and made a sham of the family. He had headed off the problems of his childhood, but presently was headed on a collision course 2 decades later. Jacob's transformation and turnaround climaxed with a humbling prayer, a heated match, and a touching reconciliation. Why is reliance on God the best way to reconcile with the past? What are the signs of true reconciliation? How are repentance and transformation related to reconciliation? First, experience God in your weakness. Genesis chapter 32, verse 6 through 12. Jacob was wiser and wealthier after 2 decades in Haran, but his true wisdom and wealth were the realization that he was a nobody if not for God's help. Without God, he would be a poor and pitiful man. Jacob's feelings reached feverish heights in verse 7's great fear. The only thing Jacob could do was to flee to God in prayer with the imperative save, deliver in verse 11. It reveals a frantic, frightened, and forlorn Jacob who heard that Esau was coming to meet him with 400 men in verse 6. Jacob was the first and only Testament character who confessed his unworthiness in verse 10. Jacob's previous vow was made to serve himself, others not included. Now he had wives, children, and servants whose very lives and livelihoods depended upon him. Now he had mouths to feed, kids to raise, and lives to protect. God's strength was perfected in Jacob's fear, flashbacks, and fixation. He was never closer to God than when he paused, pondered, and prayed, or when he shivered, sweated, and suffered. Jacob corrected himself by asking for spiritual rather and not material blessings. Genesis chapter 32, verse 26, from God rather than man, and Genesis chapter 27, verse 23. God's intention right from the start in Genesis chapter 5, verse 2, and Genesis chapter 9, verse 1. The uniqueness of Jacob was that he actively requested blessings from God rather than passively receive blessings from him. Second, empty yourself of your willfulness. Genesis chapter 32, verse 24 through 31. Jacob's real problem was his willfulness. He had an iron will, an indomitable spirit, and an insensitive attitude. God made his move to break Jacob's stubborn will. After Jacob had sent his family over to Canaan, a man who wrestled him and weakened him, the Lord clamped down hard on him. A wrestling match is unlike a boxing match. A wrestler has no chance to spar. He could only scrap. Boxers can win with a fist, but wrestlers must grapple with the body. Rearranging, relaxing, or releasing one's grip is not possible in wrestling until one surrenders. Jacob heard that he had prevailed in verse 28, but he did not feel the power. The truth was that the man was able to immobilize and injure him at will. In verse 25, the man left in terrific shape, but Jacob left with a limp. The victory did not make sense to Jacob. His triumph was symbolical, short, and surreal. He felt drained and dazed. Hosea chapter 12, verses 3 and 4 explains Jacob wept and begged for his favor. God reminded Jacob that even though he had profited and prospered at the expense of others, the path to God's blessings had to come from the fount and foundation, God himself, the one from whom all blessings flow. Third, end enmity with others willingly. Genesis chapter 33, verses 1 through 9. No action or apology was too difficult for the humble Jacob to offer to reassure his brother, to recover his family, and return to his homeland. He offered himself as the first casualty, stooping and bowing 7 times towards Esau. In verse 7, Jacob called himself 4 times to Esau's servant. Genesis chapter 32, verse 4, 18, 20. Genesis chapter 33, verse 5. And 8 times he called Esau my lord. In Genesis chapter 32, verse 4, 5, 18. Genesis chapter 33, verse 8, 13, 14, 14, and 15. Jacob gave lavishly to Esau. Genesis chapter 32, verse 14, gave praise to God and gave witness to his adequacy, asking nothing in return from his older brother. In verse 11, the verb bow occurs 7 times in chapter 33. In Genesis chapter 33, verse 3, 6, 3 times in 7, 9, and 10. There is more bowing in this chapter than any chapter in the Bible, even more than bowing in worship. By God's grace, 20 years of betrayal and bitterness was resolved face to face in one reunion, in one instant, in one day. Esau ran to Jacob, kissed him, and called him my brother. In Genesis chapter 33, verse 9, Esau was not the monster or murderer in Jacob's imagination. Before Esau said to himself, I will kill my brother Jacob, in Genesis chapter 27, verse 41. The next time Esau used the word brother kindly, I already have plenty, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself. In conclusion, are you still living with past mistakes, present fears, or perpetual despair? Have you told yourself, I am unworthy, in Genesis chapter 32, verse 10? Have you told God, I will not let you go, in Genesis chapter 32, verse 26? Testify to others, God has been gracious to me, and I have all I need, in Genesis chapter 33, verse 11. The powerful presence of God is always available to the weak. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9 and 10.